Dusk was approaching when the French locomotive, whistling shrilly to announce its arrival, wheezed into the station hidden sedately among the green-clad mountains along the French-Belgian border. The little moustached Frenchman who had jolted and jostled us across the whole of France jumped from his dominating perch in the engine and ran beside the train to join a cohort in chattering and gesticulating wildly. It was not too dark to read the faded black-and-white sign hanging above the station platform, Longuyon. I gathered my equipment and stepped from the train. Already hundreds of men in olive-drab uniforms, loaded with the variety of equipment and weapons that characterizes the American soldier, were disentangling themselves from the freight cars. I decided that the little engineer must have thought we had not played fair with his 48 cars. There was not a car in my section of the train which did not disgorge at least 43 men, plus equipment. The equipment would more than make up for the absence of the 8 horses. "I company over here!" I shouted above the noise of the detrainment. "Column of 2's facing this way! Headquarters, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th!" The milling around began to take on a semblance of unity of purpose. I signalled forward, and the column began an accordion-like action of moving off, a man here and there making a last-minute adjustment of his pack or overcoat. We moved through the gate in the dirty concrete fence of the station yard and out to the main street of the town. I dropped back from my position at the head of the column to survey the long line of men, tall ones, short ones, not unlike similar companies I had commanded in the US before coming overseas. Perhaps there was something about the way these men walked, the confident swagger, perhaps. I think I would have known, even had I been one of the silent, stone-faced civilians staring at us from the open doorways and windows along the way, that underneath those stubbly growths of beard and those wisps of straw from the boxcars clinging to the unpressed uniforms lay a wealth of battlefield experience. Company 1, 23rd Infantry, I thought. You fought your way ashore in Normandy on D+1. You battled to the top of Hill 192 to pave the way for the Saint-Lô breakout. You stormed the ring of pillboxes at Brest and had your number reduced to 50 in the explosion as the Germans blew them up in your faces. And now they give you a company commander fresh from the States. They ask you to put your faith in me. I felt weak and ineffectual. I quickened my pace, regaining my place at the head of the column as we crossed a temporary US Army bridge which had replaced the demolished ancient stone structure over the gurgling mountain stream which ran through the centre of the village. We approached the last houses on the edge of the town, and the road began its steep ascent to the hilltop beyond. Now a dirty little French boy came running out to yell some newly learned Yankee curse word at us as we passed. Now a little girl bashfully thrust a bouquet of flowers into a soldier's hands and turned to disappear behind her mother's skirts in a doorway. Our column plodded slowly up the hill, the full field packs beginning to assert their weight. Sweat formed on my body, and I wished that I had carried my heavy GI overcoat instead of wearing it. But the early evening mountain air did nip at my face and felt refreshingly cool on my hands as I took off my heavy GI woolen gloves. My nose began to run from the cold acquired on the long train ride, but I couldn't reach my handkerchief through the bundle, some overcoat and equipment. The road made a sharp bend to the left as we reached the crest. It was light enough to see the deep valley to the right, with its roving stream following the contour of the railroad track on the mountainside beyond. "Damn!" a heavily breathing soldier in my headquarters group exclaimed between clenched teeth. "I sure hope it levels off before we reach the front. It'd be a son of a bitch to fight in this kind of country." "We're still a hell of a ways from the front," another said. "How far you reckon it is, Captain?" I looked back. It was Private First Class Henry Croteau, of East Hartford, Conn. He had been the company interpreter and the company commander's runner through the campaign in France. "About 20 or 30 miles, the colonel says," I replied. The road continued upgrade and we walked on in silence. The cold wind felt good to my face. I was conscious of a heavy mist about us, which slowly turned into a fine rain, which, coupled with the overcast that had plagued us all day, boded no good for a bivouac in the open. A mile down the road, we met the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Paul V. Tuttle of San Antonio, Texas. He was a tall, handsome young West Pointer of about 28 years. His short brown hair was beginning to grey slightly at the temples, and his face had a ruddy glow from the wind as he waited for us beside the road. He motioned me to a field a few hundred yards down the road and designated a spot on the right for my company. "We'll bivouac here for the night, Mac," he said. "There's a haystack over there. Let the men heat K-rations with the boxes, but leave off the other fires. There might be some little birds around, you know." I congratulated myself upon the good fortune that had given me such an understanding battalion commander for my first combat experience, and turned off the road at the place he had designated. I directed the platoons to their respective areas in the field, and noted that K, L, M and battalion headquarters companies were following us in. Our arrival seemed to be the signal for the clouds to burst. The mist that had become a drizzle now became a torrent. The men scrambled madly to get their packs undone and shelter halves spread over equipment. Then followed the rush for the haystack. The field was already a soggy mass of mud, and the downpour of rain was making it muddier by the minute. I joined my headquarters group in heating the cans of K-rations over the oblong cardboard boxes they came in. The rain and wind made it hard to get the fires started at first, but the rain soon slackened. I wondered how I could force down another K-ration meal after 5 days of the same monotonous food aboard the train, but I found that anything edible tasted good after the hike from the station. Colonel Tuttle sent a messenger with the message for me to report to him for instructions for the morning. My executive officer said he would fix up our tent and put my equipment in out of the rain while I was gone. He was First Lieutenant Rudolph A. Sparky Flame of Rosati Mo, a husky young officer who had already qualified for 3 Purple Hearts and was on his way to flirt with the 4th. When I returned, he was snoring loudly on his own side of the little pup tent, and most of the company had turned in for the night. I walked through the disorderly rows of tents, and the thick mud made sucking noises as it pulled at my overshoes. I sought out the platoon leaders. I found First Lieutenant Long H. Goffigan of Cape Charles, VR, my first platoon leader, and First Lieutenant Alfred Ante of Evansville, IND, my 3rd platoon leader, sleeping in the same tent. First Lieutenant Thomas D. Brock of Plymouth, Mich, my 2nd platoon leader, and First Lieutenant Robert H. Glasgow of Arlington, NJ, weapons platoon leader, were together. I told them the plans for the morning and walked to the end of the field where I found 2 guards huddled in their raincoats. I told them to pass the word on to the guards who relieved them to awaken the company at 5 o'clock. We would have another K-ration breakfast before loading on trucks to continue the move. I went back to my tent and pulled off my muddy overshoes and crawled inside, but I couldn't go to sleep. Sparky had pushed well over toward my side of the tent in his sleep, and a mound of dirt positioned itself squarely in the small of my back. It had seemingly escaped the softening process of the heavy rain. My mind began to peruse the duties that were before me. In perhaps 1 day, and at the most 3 days, I would be leading these men against a team of trained killers. I wondered how I would react. These men so deserved the best in leadership. Could I give it to them? They could boast a glorious combat record already, and I knew nothing. Suddenly, all my long hours of training for just such a role as this seemed pitifully inadequate. If only there were some way I could know just what it was like. It seemed incredible that this group of hardened combat veterans could accept an inexperienced youth of 21 to lead them into battle simply because he happened to come to them wearing a set of flashy bars on his shoulders. If only I could look into their minds to see what they were thinking. I was awakened the next morning by someone rapping on my tent and shouting that it was 5 o'clock. It was dark, but the rain had stopped. That would make it slightly less disagreeable to roll up wet shelter halves and damp equipment to strap to one's back. We had scarcely enough time to heat a K-ration meal before battalion headquarters sent a runner to tell us to load on the trucks. The truck ride took us through a portion of Belgium before we crossed the border into the Duchy of Luxembourg. Civilians began to come to their doors to greet us with enthusiastic cheers and 2 fingers upraised in the V for Victory sign. In one town, an effigy of Adolf Hitler hung suspended by the neck from a rope above the road. Everywhere there were spontaneous expressions of gratitude. I felt a surging feeling of pride within me that for the moment pushed my fears of the future into the background. If war but consisted of only travel and cheers from a grateful populace. We crossed the Luxembourg border and entered Belgium once again, noticing an increase in the military traffic. As our trucks rolled into Schoenberg, Belgium, numerous command post and hospital installations, the increased number of German shop signs, and the apathy of the civilians told us we could not be far from Germany. Our convoy turned off the highway at Schoenberg and wound slowly up a sandy dirt road leading into the thick fir forests beyond the town. We rode on, and the forest seemed of an impenetrable depth. The sandy road gave out eventually, and we found ourselves on an unimproved trail that had become a morass of mud from unaccustomed heavy traffic. Our convoy came to a halt. We had reached the spot for our bivouac. Beneath the dense covering of the fir trees, our kitchens were already set up. They had arrived from France by motor the evening before. An appetizing supper of hamburgers and vegetables awaited us, but it proved too much for my stomach after the week's diet of K-rations, and I suffered pains from overeating. Darkness had fallen, and the company was beginning to turn in for the night when I was called to battalion headquarters. The colonel had set up a small command post tent in the woods. A gasoline lantern took some of the chill off the night air inside. The other company commanders were already there. I was handed 5 maps, one for myself and one for each of my platoon leaders. The colonel did not waste much time. He said, "I'd like to give you the information I have so you can get back and get some sleep." My pulse quickened. "So this is it," I said to myself, using a phrase that every replacement uses 1,000 times before he ever actually reaches combat. I would soon know if I could take it. I would soon know if I could justify the faith of the men from Company 1. "It looks as if we've finally drawn a good assignment," Colonel Tuttle continued, and I breathed somewhat easier. Already, whirling visions of attacking formidable Siegfried Line pillboxes had been flashing through my mind. "We're to relieve the 28th Division in the defence of a stretch along the Siegfried Line. It's supposed to be a quiet sector, so they tell us. There've been a few small-scale German counterattacks in the area and some artillery and SP fire, but at least it's quieter than the attack." There were questions and a general discussion. "Now," the colonel continued, "we leave in the morning at 7 o'clock. Have your kitchens prepare a hot breakfast. They'll move up later under Lieutenant Koch. We'll go to a forward assembly area back of the line where you can issue more ammunition. Then we'll have time for reconnaissance, and the actual relief will take place tomorrow night." We dispersed to our company areas. In the darkness outside the tent, I noticed the flashes of artillery to the east, and the deep rumble of the big guns came from the distance. A voice in my brain kept repeating, "This is it! This is it!" I stumbled blindly through the dark forest in the direction of the company. I stopped by the first sergeant's tent, where I found First Sergeant Henry D. Albin of Houston, Texas, huddled in his tent with a raincoat over the entrance as a blackout curtain. He was a young, auburn-haired, red-faced Texan who drawled pleasantly when he talked. He was preparing the company morning report by flashlight. "How does it look?" he asked. "Not too bad," I answered. "It's the defense." "Could be worse then, I guess," he said. "If it ain't bad, it'll be the first time this outfit ever drew a good assignment." I asked him to send for the platoon leaders to receive the information I had about the situation. They soon gathered around the tent. I was beginning to give them the information when a soldier stepped from the darkness. "Is the first sergeant round?" the soldier asked. "Right here," Sergeant Albin answered. "I'm from the 9th Infantry, Sergeant," the soldier said. "We're bivouacked just across the way, and I got a ride over, so I figured I'd stop by to see my brother. I haven't seen him in some time, but he's in this company." "What's the name?" "Wagram," the soldier answered. "Wagram. His first name's—" The feeble light from the flashlight inside the tent shone briefly on the soldier's face. Yeah, I know," Sergeant Albin interrupted. "In the 3rd Platoon, with us at Brest, killed in action there." Our truck convoy wound its way back through the thick forest into Schönberg the next morning and out again over the highway leading east. As we neared the German border, the road began a steep ascent to the mountains to our front. A big white signboard with glaring black letters told us what we were near. "You are now entering Germany, an enemy country. Be on the alert." I looked at my watch. It was 11:15 on the morning of October 3rd, 1944. We were entering the country at a point approximately 12 miles east of St. Vith, Belgium, in the Schnee-Eifel forest. The old iron border gate stood open, mud-splashed by the army traffic. The road twisted and turned like some giant snake slithering up the steep slopes. The boom of big artillery pieces grew nearer. We turned from the highway on a freshly ploughed dirt road to the left, and the drivers shifted gears as the big trucks sank into the mud. The artillery pieces that had heralded our approach appeared in a deep valley to our right, behind grey puffs of smoke as they belched their big noise into the spaces beyond. Our convoy pulled to a halt, and the driver cut the ignition and jumped out to open the tailgate. I gathered my equipment and stepped out on the muddy ground. This was Germany. We lined up in the familiar column of twos on either side of the muddy road for the 2-mile walk to the forward assembly area. The overcast skies with perpetual threat of rain made a sticky murkiness of the atmosphere despite the nipping cold, and the accustomed perspiration of road marches appeared beneath our overcoats. We reached the assembly area in a thick scrub oak woods shortly after noon. We had no sooner halted and begun to disentangle ourselves from the burdensome packs than Captain Jimmy Anderson of Cushing, Ockler, the battalion operations officer, rode up in a jeep. "Turn your company over to your exec and have him feed dinner," he said. "Your kitchen should be up shortly. Bring what officers you want to go on reconnaissance and come with me. The old man's ready to go right now. Be calm, be businesslike. This is the same as manoeuvres. Give some orders. Start things moving. You're going to have a look at the German army." I turned and mumbled instructions to Sparky and sent for the 4 platoon leaders. Sergeant Raymond Savage of Mobile, Allah, walked over to me. He was my communications sergeant, a small, good-looking young Southerner who spoke slowly in a matter-of-fact Alabama drawl. I had come to know him better than anyone else in the company thus far. He had a friendliness that was difficult to resist. "You going up, Captain?" he asked. Savage had a way of never slurring the title of captain, but pronouncing both syllables clearly, despite his deep Southern accent. "Yeah," I said, making an effort at nonchalance. "Right away." "Can I go with you?" he asked. "I'd like to check on the communications setup." "I'm afraid not, Savage," I answered. "There's only one jeep, and I have to take the platoon leaders." "Okay," he said, as if he had half expected a refusal. "But watch yourself, Captain." His face looked worried. "Don't go sticking your neck out the first thing. And for God's sake, hide those damned captain's bars." I looked at the shiny objects on my shoulders and hastily pulled them off and stuffed them into my pockets. The platoon leaders arrived. We climbed into the company jeep, driven by Private First Class James Earnhardt of Mooresville, North Carolina, and moved down the trail to join the other company commanders. The road to the battalion command post of the unit we were to relieve twisted in and out of the woods beneath low-hanging limbs. We reached a clearing. A sign said, "Windshields covered beyond this point." We crossed a hill and saw the little German farming town of Grofkampkenberg, with its closely clustered houses and barnyards, and the inevitable manure piles. We ploughed through the black filth of mud that covered the road and pulled up to a white house in the centre of the town. Here and there an artillery shell had plunged through a roof or knocked off the corner of a chimney. A dead cows had become for us a sort of symbol of the war in France, lay with legs upstretched in the open field to the left of the road. A guide from the company we were to relieve joined us, and I heard Colonel Tuttle admonishing us to return by 3:30 p.m, and the guide was saying, "Ready?" and I was swallowing and answering, "Yes." We had come as far as we could by vehicle, but the guide said we had 1.5 miles yet to go. We ran across an open hill on the east edge of town because the guide said the enemy could observe us from the towering blue hills to our front. We continued in a narrow valley, and I tried to note each terrain feature as we passed. It would be night when I would lead the company over the route. I noted that the terrain was no longer mountainous, but had given way to a series of rolling hills and valleys. We crossed a slight knoll, and the anti-tank wall of the Siegfried Line came suddenly into view. It looked like a prehistoric monster coiled around the hillsides. The concrete dragon's teeth were like scales upon the monster's back, or maybe headstones in a kind of crazy cemetery. We crossed the anti-tank wall. The open mouths of 2 pillboxes yawned at us from the slope ahead. We passed the pillboxes and skirted the left edge of a thick patch of fir trees. The ground was covered with black holes where shells had hit and exploded. The dragon's teeth coiled across our path again, and we crossed them again. Tucked into the slope of a higher hill to our front was a row of 8 concrete pillboxes, completely dug into the hillside except for their faces. "We'll have to run again here," the guide said, and pointed to a high slope to our right front, peopled by a similar row of pillbox giants. "That's theirs!" We ran across the ploughed field and halted for breath at the entrance to a pillbox at the crest of the slope. The entrance had been filled in with dirt. 2 soldiers rose up to view us from shallow slit trenches dug near the entrance. "You better keep low," one of them said. "They've been shooting here all day." "This is part of L Company," our guide announced, ignoring the warning except for a quick look toward the speaker that must have said thanks. We imitated our guide's half-crouch as we ran from the pillbox to a thin hedge that ran parallel with the ridge along its crest. I could still see the enemy pillboxes in the distance to our right, and they could very evidently see us, but I realized as I looked around that our guide had taken the only concealment the ground afforded us. I could discern the general outline of the defensive position we were to occupy. The battalion's position was to be in the shape of a giant horseshoe with Company 1 embedded in the centre of the arc. We would have been exposed from the other side of the hedge as well. I imitated the guide's cautiousness as we advanced, but I was strangely unafraid. I was a bit awed by the momentousness of it. You are inside the Siegfried Line. But thus far it had been child's play. We continued for 200 yards when the guide suddenly veered into the hedge, and we found ourselves in the shaded backyard of a 2-story farmhouse. We followed the guide in a back window, and I knew we had reached our destination. We found the company commander, a first lieutenant, in a small, low cellar illuminated only by a dim kerosene lantern that needed its shade washed. There were men in every conceivable sleeping position all over the floor. The lieutenant suggested that we move upstairs where we could talk, and we made our way again up the dark, narrow staircase that led from the cellar. When we reached the light of the first floor, I saw that the lieutenant's eyes were bloodshot, and a half-week's growth of beard covered his face. His voice trembled slightly when he talked, and he would start at the slightest noise. He asked if I had my platoon leaders with me, and I indicated my lieutenants. He sent 2 runners for his own platoon leaders. "I can't get the 3rd platoon leader now," he said. "Can't reach the 3rd platoon in daylight, but he can go with the 2nd platoon. He can see the positions from there." He interrupted himself to admonish 2 soldiers to move more quietly when they walked. "By the way, they're all sergeants. I have only 1 officer left besides myself." He flinched perceptibly at the sound of a door closing. I conferred with my platoon leaders, and we set our time for reassembly at the company command post in the farmhouse at 3 o'clock. The company commander and I went upstairs to the forward room on the 2nd floor. From the upstairs window, I could see a towering ridge rising to our front, spotted with poorly camouflaged pillboxes and patches of trees. A small farming town lay in a valley between us and the high ridge. "It's not too bad a position," the lieutenant said. "You all have winter clothes, and we haven't had a chance to get ours yet. That'll be a hell of a big help. Jerry throws quite a bit of artillery and mortars at you," he continued, "and we've had some casualties, but it was their own fault for moving around in the daytime when they knew they shouldn't. We haven't had any counterattacks or patrols hit us yet, and we've been here 15 days. K Company on our right got the living hell knocked out of them 2 nights ago. A swarm of Kraut infantry hit 'em along with a flame-throwing half-track, caught a lot of men in a pillbox and stampeded the company. My right platoon started falling back until I got 'em stopped. They counterattacked the next morning, however, and got their positions back. They found some of the men who hadn't run still holding their foxholes. The attack against K Company, with the loss of the men in the pillbox, was the basis for a battalion order to move out of all pillboxes, the lieutenant said. That was the reason for the I Company CP being in the farmhouse. It had originally been in a bunker-type pillbox to the right rear of the house, and since there was no other spot available, it was necessary to move into the crowded farmhouse, even though it was in L Company's area. I decided immediately that I would take the chance and move my CP into the pillbox when we came up that night. The farmhouse was too crowded. A closer look through the window revealed a line of foxholes a few yards in front of the house. The lieutenant explained that these belonged to the right flank platoon of L Company. A small trail running along the right of the farmhouse was the dividing line between the companies and led down into the valley to the German-held town, which my map labelled Utfeld. The 3 rifle platoon positions my men would occupy extended 500 yards to the right of the trail. There were no windows on the right side of the farmhouse, so we moved downstairs and out into the backyard to view the platoon positions. "Your 3rd platoon on the right has it worst," the lieutenant said, pointing toward the outline of foxholes on a small knoll to the right front. "They're completely exposed. Can't even raise their heads out of their holes in daylight without some goddamn Kraut taking a shot at them. We can't contact them by runner except at night. There's a 200-yard gap on their right before K Company starts, which ain't good, of course." Over the entire area, the Germans from the high ridge to the front and right front had perfect observation of our positions. Their view was supplemented by that of those who occupied the high ridge on our left, but the observation from the left was restricted by the foliage surrounding the farmhouse. I decided to dispose of my company initially, as the lieutenant had done. We could make changes later. I would have preferred holding one of my rifle platoons in a support position, but it seemed unwise, for our company frontage was great. My platoon leaders reassembled at the farmhouse. Our guide had waited to go back with us, and upon his suggestion, we moved back in groups of 2 to give the enemy a less profitable target. I decided to wait until the last to leave. Lieutenant Brock, my 2nd platoon leader, elected to remain with me. I was filled with misgivings about the return trip until we should reach the concealment of the patch of fir trees, but when the other platoon leaders drew no fire as they crossed the open space, my fears partially subsided. Brock and I made our way in a half-crouch beside the hedge, more conscious now that our only concealment from the enemy depended upon our blending with the foliage on our right. We reached a point opposite the pillbox where we had encountered the men in the slit trenches on the trip forward and started out on a run across the crest of the hill. I had almost reached the cover of the pillbox when the projectiles from a 20 anti-aircraft gun began to crack overhead. I hit the ground instinctively. I found myself behind a small knoll formed by the embedded pillbox and was thus protected from the enemy fire. I was beginning to congratulate myself on choosing the position when I looked to my right. 5 feet from me lay a German soldier, crumpled as he had fallen and bloated in death. It was my first view of a dead man, and I tried to avoid the revulsion that filled me by quickly turning my eyes away. We crawled down to the face of the pillbox and paused for a moment to catch our breath. I started the journey again by dashing across the ploughed field that led to the first row of dragon's teeth, expecting at any moment to see the bullets from the anti-aircraft gun kick up the dirt around my feet. I could hear Lieutenant Brock panting as he ran behind me, but the sound of bullets did not come. In its stead came the sharp crack and heavy explosion that I knew must be mortar fire falling behind me. It sounded as if the shells were falling on the crest of the ridge we had so recently left, but I took no time to look back. I increased my speed and dived behind a clump of bushes next to the outer row of dragon's teeth. There would be no protection from those bushes against the mortar shells, but I was comforted by their concealment. I lay there panting. It could not have been more than a minute before Brock joined me, but it seemed like 10. I sighed in relief. His face was white and his breath came in gasps, but he was unhurt. When he had regained his breath, he stammered out his story. "Those damn mortars," he said. "The concussion must have thrown me at least 3 feet into the air and then flat on my face on the ground." We made an effort to laugh at his narrow escape and continued the journey past the patch of fir trees and into Grof-Kempkenberg. In Grof-Kempkensberg, Colonel Tuttle told me that my company would be the first to move up that night. We would leave our assembly area around 10 o'clock in order to begin effecting the relief at midnight. The other 2 rifle companies would leave at 2-hour intervals thereafter. Thus, one company would be completely in position before another had begun. We rode our jeep back to the company assembly area. The mess sergeant, Staff Sergeant Lee W. Threadgill of Franklin, Texas, had saved dinner for us, but the company was eating supper when we arrived. We ate the 2 meals together, and I gave final instructions to the platoon leaders as we ate. The men were to carry 3 meals of K-rations and their blanket rolls with them. They would leave their gas masks and duffel bags to be transported by service company. I arranged to have my jeep driver follow L Company's jeep to the L Company CP after darkness and bring with him a load of ammunition and our heavier weapons, the light machine guns and 60 mm mortars. Darkness had fallen, and a misty rain was coming down when I completed the arrangements. I climbed into the back of the kitchen truck and smoked a cigarette and listened to the slow tick of my watch as 10 o'clock rolled nearer. "This is it! This is it!" My brain kept repeating madly over and over. I must not appear afraid. I must give these men confidence in me despite the fact that they know I'm inexperienced. They were playing their parts well. I had been unable to detect any attitude of distrust in their actions, and I had searched their faces for long periods at a time. I must keep that confidence. I must! I must! "Scared, Captain?" Sergeant Savage asked. "A little," I admitted. I took a long, slow drag on my cigarette. "We all are," Savage said. "We always are." The rain had stopped, and somewhere there was a moon hidden by the clouds as we collected our equipment and set out on the night march to the front. It was a slow, fatiguing march under the burden of the mounting tension and the heavy equipment. Our guide from the afternoon joined us in Grof-Kempkenberg. I was surprised because I had not expected he would be with us. After we had passed the patch of fir trees, the guide led us in a more direct line toward our objective than we had travelled on the reconnaissance. We crossed the Dragon's Teeth and began the ascent of the slope beyond. I made out the outline of the slight rise that would be the pillbox I was to use for a command post. I stumbled and looked down at my feet. An American soldier, fully clothed even to his helmet, lay on his back with glassy eyes turned skyward and his arms outstretched. His body was almost twice its normal size. I shuddered involuntarily. The shock of almost stepping upon the body before seeing it left me weak inside. The guide stooped down and retrieved the automatic rifle that lay beside the body, swinging the weapon over his shoulder. "Must be one of our barmen," he said casually. "He headed for the battalion the other day. There was a mortar barrage. We hadn't heard from him since." We reached the entrance to the pillbox in the rear of the farmyard a few moments later. Guides from the rifle platoons of the 28th Division Company asked in hoarse stage whispers what platoon it was. I directed my company headquarters group to the pillbox and dispatched the rifle platoons with their guides into the darkness beyond, telling them that we would have telephone lines to them as soon as possible. I grew openly nervous lest we be caught by an enemy artillery barrage with a large number of men on the exposed hilltop. The lieutenant from the 28th Division appeared, and we moved together down the incline that led to the circuitous entrance of the pillbox. A giant hole had been dug into the ground on the crest of the hill, and the massive concrete emplacement had been constructed within, its entrance facing the rear of the farmhouse across the trail. Its roof was constructed of 4 feet of reinforced concrete with 3 feet of dirt making a slight mound above. The walls were 6 feet thick. I noted the size of the big bunker as we entered. It was 16 feet square and 8 feet high. The men from my headquarters were arranging their equipment on 3 rows of iron frame bunks with laced rope bottoms that were suspended in tiers of 3 each from the ceiling along each side. In the left front corner, an iron door led to a small concrete storage room. A candle burned on a table at the front of the pillbox. It cast flickering shadows on the walls and revealed a hand-operated ventilation device against the left wall. On the right, next to the floor, was a small door that, when opened, revealed a fireplace that ended in the tin chimney I had seen silhouetted against the sky outside. Signs and mottos in German script were on each wall. The concrete floor was littered with empty cardboard cartons and K-ration tins. The air was cold, damp, stale, and smelled of dust and dried man-sweat. Sergeant Olbin was busy with the morning report. Private First Class Lupe Naranjo of Aqua Dulce, Texas, and Private First Class Walter Zellin of Boston, Mass. The 2 men who served as messengers from the battalion CP waited to take the report back with them. Sergeant Savage was attaching the company's field telephone to a line that entered the room through a small slit which commanded a view of the entrance and could be closed by pushing a small concrete block across it, thus blacking out the pillbox completely. "I ought to have communication with the battalion in a couple of minutes, Captain," Savage said. "I'm using the 28th Infantry's old line." He soon made contact with the battalion, and there was a call waiting for us. "It's L Company," he said. "Nefach has got our mortars and machine guns and some ammunition at their CP. He told them that we would have someone there to pick them up in a few minutes, and then gathered up his wire-laying equipment. Private First Class Luther T. Blackburn of Oklahoma City, Okla, one of the SCR 300 operators, would assist him. They would lay telephone wire to the forward platoons. A man from the 28th Division came in to report to his company commander that messengers from all 4 of his platoons had reported outside with the information that the platoons had all pulled out. The lieutenant turned to me. "Is there anything else then, Captain?" he asked. "No, I think not," I said, trying in vain to think of something I might have forgotten and a bit alarmed that soon I would be entirely on my own. I reported our progress to Colonel Tuttle, and the lieutenant talked with his own battalion commander and asked me to tell his CO that I was satisfied. I did so, and the lieutenant prepared to leave, taking my 2 battalion runners with him. He seemed overjoyed at the prospect of leaving, and I wondered if someday I would be just as happy to leave this area. And how long would that someday be? A week, 2 weeks, a month, 2 months? There was no way of knowing. We might sit here until the war ended, or we might leave tomorrow. I closed my eyes for a brief moment and murmured a silent prayer. The lieutenant was gone. I was on my own. Lieutenant Glasgow, Scotty, my weapons platoon leader, whose love for Scotch whisky and insistence that his name was pronounced with a G and not a C were standing jokes in the company, came in a few minutes after the lieutenant from the 28th had left. He said his platoon CP was in the back room of the house across the trail. He was setting up 1 mortar in the rear of the house, and the other 2 beside the rearmost and smaller of the 2 wooden sheds behind the house. The positions afforded no cover, only concealment, but they were the only available positions. L Company was using all the pillboxes to our rear. I told him that the machine guns and mortars were at L Company's CP and directed him there. He asked for several men from my company headquarters to help him carry ammunition and left with his mortar section to bring up the equipment. Sergeant Savage called over the sound-powered telephone from the 1st platoon and then from the 2nd and the 3rd. I was glad when I heard the first whistle over the phone that indicated that the lines were in. A whistle, plus the call sign of the party desired, was the signal, since all platoons were on a party line. We had adopted the same call signs for both telephone and SCR 536, the famed little walkie-talkies, using nicknames of the platoon leaders or their last names, plus the numerical designation of the platoon, long 1 for the 1st platoon, Brock 2, Ante 3, Scotty 4, and merely CP for the company command post. I was greatly relieved that the communications were in. I wondered how the lieutenant from the 28th Division had endured the nervous tension of the pillbox positions for 15 days without communications to his platoons. One platoon, or all platoons, might have been completely overrun by the enemy before a foot messenger could get back to the command post, if he got back. First, Sergeant Albin made up a guard roster from the company headquarters group. Each man would guard outside the pillbox in two-man shifts that would change every 2 hours. Savage and Blackburn would split the night on the telephones. Sparky went to sleep early so that he could take over from me later, thus ensuring that one of us would be awake at all times. Scotty returned with the machine guns and mortars at 2 o'clock. I didn't like the prospect of hand-carrying all our supplies from the L Company CP, exposing the carrying detail to enemy shelling for long periods, but it seemed impractical to bring a jeep as far forward as my command post. I didn't plan to sleep at all the first night. Now that we were in position and the difficulties of moving in no longer worried me, I was filled with a growing fear that the Germans might hit us with a counterattack. In reality, such German action would have been an attack, but like all GIs, I thought of any German attack as a counterattack. I decided that the enemy must surely know that new troops were moving in and would attempt to dislodge us while we might still be disorganized. Despite my fears, I was confident that Company 1 I would meet with little difficulty in holding the positions. Already we had communications which far surpassed those of the unit we had relieved, and where they had had no anti-tank defences, except a small string of mines on the trail running along our left flank, we had 7 rocket launchers, bazookas. I had placed 2 of the launchers with each forward platoon and kept one for the protection of the CP. And already I was thoroughly imbued with the spirit common among all infantrymen that my outfit is the best damned outfit in the whole damned army. It could boast of a record to prove it. I was certainly not a veteran in combat, but I was no novice in my esteem for Company 1. I talked with the 3 rifle platoon leaders over the telephone. They were thoroughly dissatisfied with their positions. The foxholes were little more than depressions in the ground, they said, and poorly disposed. Both the 1st and 2nd platoons wanted to occupy 2 pillboxes in their areas. Already they had begun to dig out the entrances which the preceding unit had covered with a bulldozer to prevent the Germans from reoccupying them if they were retaken. The 3rd platoon was changing the disposition of a few foxholes, but little could be done to lessen the daylight vulnerability of their position. The platoon leaders said there were about 15 corpses in different spots over the company area, both German and American dead. Sergeant Savage said he was sliding under a fence while laying the wire to the platoons when he reached out and grasped the bare chest of a dead German. I told them I would call the battalion the next day in an effort to get a graves registration unit to remove the dead. Lieutenant Brock said his platoon had discovered a US tank destroyer 75 yards in front of his position. A 2-man crew that had been there 3 days since their vehicle had become stuck in the mud in the draw still occupied the TD. The 4th platoon said there was another TD a few yards to the left of the shed occupied by 2 of the mortar squads, but it had been completely knocked out by a German shell. The short candle in the pillbox flickered and went out. The command post settled down to an extravaganza of snores, the occasional ring of the battalion telephone, and low conversation between Savage and me. The routine was broken occasionally by the surprised comments of a sleeper as another man awakened him to go on guard. Savage began to nod from sleepiness, and his head fell forward on the table. I did not awaken him. I was alone with my thoughts in the cold, damp darkness. 11 men in a pillbox. 11 men who must live from day to day, never thinking of the immediate future, but only of the infinity when the war would someday be over. There was Sparky, First Sergeant Albin, Savage, Blackburn, Croto, and me. There was Private First Class Willie Hagan, the tobacco-chewing 39-year-old Army regular who kept us laughing with sage tactical wisdom and served as first platoon runner. Then there was Private First Class Angelo Butare of Boston, 2D platoon runner who had lost 2 brothers already in the war. Private First Class Hubert Berger of Memphis 10, 3D platoon runner who was 18 years old and read his Bible every night. Private First Class Kenneth Lampton of Detroit, Mich. Weapons platoon runner who was also 18 and corresponded with college girls from Michigan. and Private First Class Erling G. Selberg of Fargo, North Dakota, who was 19 and cleanly good-looking and the headquarters bazooka man. The cooks and jeep drivers, the supply sergeant, and the mail orderly had been left behind with the service company to keep us supplied. The changing of the guard at 4 o'clock revealed that it was raining outside, a slow, cold, miserable drizzle. I thought of the men in the forward platoons in their exposed foxholes with no protection from the elements, except shelter halves stretched across their holes, and nothing between them and the hostile killers in front of us but the muzzles of their own rifles. I had admired the unglamorous infantry soldier before, but as the rain continued to fall and the night grew colder, my pride at being a part of this dirty, miserable infantry knew no bounds. The night wore on, quiet but for the pounding of our own artillery on the ridges to our front, sometimes a distant rumble, sometimes a heavy cracking explosion not far away. I nodded as the urge for sleep protested against denial, but then I would moisten my eyelids with saliva or pound my knuckles against my forehead, and the remembrance of the deep-rooted fear of a German counterattack would bring me back to my senses. Around 6 o'clock, I stepped across the trail to the shed behind the farmhouse to urinate, and saw that faint vestiges of dawn were appearing across the distant hills. There was something spooky about it. I returned to the pillbox and woke up Savage. We opened a breakfast K-ration and devoured its chopped ham and egg mixture with a cup of coffee between us, which Savage heated in his canteen cup. The long night was over. We awakened Sparky and Blackburn and changed places with them. I slept with all my clothes on to combat the damp chill of the underground pillbox and to be prepared for any eventuality. Daylight would be no detriment to sleep, I realized as I climbed into the bunk. The pillbox was as dark in the daytime as it had been at night. I slept well except for occasional awakenings from the noise of someone sweeping out the pillbox or coughing from the acrid smoke of burning K-ration cartons as the men awoke and heated their breakfasts. One of the men from the TD in the 2D platoon area came in around 9 o'clock to use the telephone. He wanted permission from his outfit to abandon the TD and return. He got his permission, and I went back to sleep. 12 rounds of enemy mortar fire fell 100 yards in rear of the pillbox around noon, but I scarcely noticed it as I turned over in my sleep. I heard Sparky talking with the platoon leaders in an effort to pick up the location from which the enemy weapons were firing when 12 more rounds fell to the rear of the 3D platoon at 1 o'clock. I got up at 3 o'clock and dusted from my hair the loose dirt and straw that had fallen from the bunk above me, and wiped the sleep from my eyes with my hand. I had not shaved since the day we detrained at Longuyon, and the stubble felt rough on my face. I had difficulty finding a breakfast K-ration since they were the least evil of the 3 meals, and disappeared more quickly than the dinners and suppers, but I found one and stepped to the entrance of the pillbox to heat it. Rain continued to fall in a thin needlepoint spray. I talked with the platoon leaders again over the sound-powered telephone and got a list of the items that they wanted brought up with the rations after dark. I added a list of my own and called it in to the battalion supply officer. The main request was for several types of ammunition, including 60 mm mortar shells adapted for firing from the M1 rifle with the aid of a grenade launcher. My men had found the expedient to be most effective in street fighting in Brest, and swore that it was more effective than either hand grenades or fragmentation rifle grenades. It, in effect, put the equivalent of 60 mm mortars in the forward foxholes. I was standing a few feet outside the entrance to the pillbox when one of our own artillery shells whistled menacingly overhead. I started instinctively toward the safety of the pillbox. The men laughed at me and said, "That's ours." I felt foolish and wondered if I would ever be able to tell the difference between incoming and outgoing shells. An enemy artillery piece fired 10 rounds into the area around 5 o'clock. The barrage centered 100 yards to the rear of the CP in relatively the same position as the mortar barrage at noon, but the shells did no damage. The rain stopped around 6, but the weather stayed damp and cold, and the skies showed no signs of clearing. Night began to fall, and I yearned for the long days of summer when the sun had not set until 10 or 11 o'clock. Night, with its long hours of mysteries and uncertainties, was the time to fear. Colonel Tuttle telephoned from the battalion. He was planning to send a platoon of 57 anti-tank guns into position around the farmhouse during the night, and wanted to know if I thought it possible to tow the guns all the way forward with jeeps. I was elated. A dread fear of the enemy's terror-provoking, flame-throwing half-track had persisted since my initial conversation with the nervous lieutenant from the 28th Division. The presence of the anti-tank guns would practically wipe away the danger of the half-track. Yes, I thought it possible to tow the guns forward. Yes, yes, yes. When darkness came, Sergeant Albin rounded up the carrying detail to go for the rations and supplies at the L Company CP. He left only a skeleton force at the CP, 2 men on guard, Savage on the phones, and Lieutenant Flame and myself. But the detail was still too small. I called Scotty, and he sent 2 squads of mortarmen and left only a skeleton crew on the 3rd gun. The carrying detail had been gone only 5 minutes when a call came from the 2D platoon. It was Technical Sergeant Rupert L. Middlebrook of Long Beach, Caliph Tullas, the platoon sergeant. "There's some sort of track vehicle out to our front, Captain, about 600 yards, and it's headed this way." The phone seemed to be a conductor that sent an electric thrill through my body. The flame-throwing half-track I had so recently shelved into the back of my mind suddenly reared up before my eyes and began spurting hideous orange, deadly flame over the area. A wave of fear possessed me. My body began to shake uncontrollably. My voice trembled despite my efforts to control it. I felt foolish at being afraid, and I hoped the others did not notice it, but I could not stop my body from trembling. "Get battalion!" I cried to Savage. I turned again to the sound-powered phone. "I'm getting a battalion. We'll try to get artillery." And then, when that seemed inadequate, "Just what does it sound like?" "I can't tell exactly," Middlebrook said. "It might be a tank or a half-track, but the son of a bitch is headed this way. We've been hearing it for some time, but I wanted to be sure before I called." Willie Hagan, on guard outside the CP, burst into the pillbox. "There's a G tank headed this way, Captain. We can hear it plain out here. It's in front of the 1st platoon." I nodded to Willie, and Savage told him I was on that now. "Can you get a light to look at your map?" I asked Middlebrook. "I want you to tell me what artillery concentration you think might get it." "I can't use a light," he answered, "but it sounds like it's on that road that runs up through the town. Maybe you can figure close to it from your map, and I can adjust." I adjusted my map to the faint light of the kerosene lantern we had borrowed from the L Company platoon in the farmhouse earlier in the day. Concentration number 221 was on the road leading out of the town. I would try that one first, and Middlebrook could adjust it by sound from his position. Savage handed me the battalion phone. I grasped it with one hand, keeping the platoon phone glued to the opposite ear. "I'm getting battalion now," I said into the sound-powered phone. "Make it snappy," a voice cut in that I knew was Lieutenant Goffigan. "This is Long, Captain. We can hear it plain now, and it's headed right this way, coming pretty fast." Captain Anderson was at the other end of the battalion wire. I made a desperate effort to control my trembling voice, but I knew I had failed. I outlined our situation hurriedly and called for concentration. "Coming right up," Captain Anderson said. "Hold on." I waited for what seemed an interminable period. Long and Middlebrook discussed the situation in one ear. Lieutenant Ante, the 3D platoon leader, joined the discussion. He could hear the vehicle now, although he hadn't heard it at first. The battalion switchboard operator spoke in a maddeningly polite voice. "Have you finished, sir? Have you finished, sir?" I said, "Waiting," and my mind echoed the words, "Waiting, waiting, waiting." I glanced at my watch. It had been only 2 minutes since I first talked with Captain Anderson, but it seemed more like 2 hours. My God, would the artillery never come? Long was talking again on the platoon phone. "What do you think now, Middlebrook? Sounds like it's stopped for me." "A reprieve! A reprieve!" I felt weak with relief inside. "Yeah, I think so too," Middlebrook answered. "It seems to have— No, there she comes again. It's a hell of a lot closer this time. What about the artillery, Captain?" The overwhelming fear returned, but a sudden melodious whistle of outgoing artillery played nocturnes in my ear. Captain Anderson's voice came simultaneously over the battalion telephone. "Hey, Mac! They're firing 3 rounds for you to adjust. Let me know what it looks like. On the way!" I had but a moment to yell "on the way" in the platoon phone before I heard the crunch of the big shells in the distance. "What do you think, Middlebrook?" I asked. "I couldn't tell too well, Captain. I have to adjust by sound, and it sounded over to me." "This is long, Captain. I can't see too well either, but I'd say it was 200 over. I couldn't adjust on deflection, but it seemed okay." For a fleeting moment, I envied the calmness of their voices, then repeated their decision to Captain Anderson. 200 over, he repeated. "I'll ask them to give you a battery volley this time. How's that?" The time seemed much shorter before the whistle of the shells across. "I can hear it again," Long shouted over the phone. "But it's running away now. Let 'em raise it 100 and give it to 'em again." I repeated the directions. I had a quick enveloping feeling of elation over our apparent success. I could hear Captain Anderson repeating the sensing at the other end of the wire. 9 more rounds whistled overhead. The shells hit. "We must not have gotten it," Middlebrook said, "but we sure scared hell out of whatever it was. He's batting hell out of there now. You can hardly hear him, he's so far away." I sighed and glanced at Savage. He had been sitting with his ear practically in the phones. He gave a sly smile. I answered it with a broad beam of pleasure. Willie Hagan, who had surveyed the entire proceedings with a practised eye, turned and joined his companion on guard. I thanked Captain Anderson. Savage gave the battalion phone a slight ring to indicate that we had finished. The voice of the switchboard operator sounded musical now. "Have you finished, sir? Have you finished?" Even as I relaxed with relief at the exit of the enemy tank, if indeed it had been a tank, I began to think of the carrying detail which had left earlier for L Company's CP. The crack of mortar shells dropping unheralded from the sky, followed a fraction of a second later by the dull boom of explosions, reached my ears. I exchanged mutual looks of anxiety with Sparky and Savage, but there was nothing we could do but await the return of the detail and hope blindly they had escaped the barrage. I ran to the entrance of the pillbox and watched the orange light of the explosions as the last rounds fell. They seemed centred about 200 yards to the rear of the CP, directly on the crest of the ridge. I went back inside to the vigil beside the telephones to await their return. Each minute that passed increased my anxiety. The challenge of the guard outside some 15 minutes later, followed by a mumbled password and the noise of equipment being placed on the ground, was welcome to my ears. They were back. Sergeant Albin was the first to enter the pillbox. He said, "We just missed it. We had started back, and the jeeps had just left when the mortars started popping. There were some L Company men still around, and it hit right where they unloaded the equipment, but nobody got it. I was relieved for the moment, but decided I would not risk exposing the carrying detail to the same dangers again. If the anti-tank guns make it okay tonight, we'll have Nefach come all the way up with the supplies tomorrow night." Sergeant Albin told Savage to call the platoons to send carrying parties to take the food and equipment to the platoon areas, while he broke it down into platoon sections outside. "We've got coffee and steak sandwiches out here," he said, "but it's all cold as a witch's tit." The cold steak sandwiches tasted like food for a king. I knew they must have tasted even better to the cold, hungry riflemen and machine gunners in their rain-drenched foxholes, despite the cold and darkness in which they had to eat. The coffee was equally as cold, but the CP group and mortar section could reheat it over K-ration boxes. It was impossible for the riflemen to have fires, even in daylight, so I called battalion for heating tablets, which burn with little smoke, but I was informed that they were a critical item and could not be obtained. I had asked battalion about the possibility of obtaining a graves registration unit to remove the bodies from the area, but I was told that no such unit was available. We would have to remove the bodies ourselves. The colonel finally weakened at my emphasized distaste and agreed to let us bury the German dead in an unoccupied pillbox, removing their identification papers to be sent to the rear, and to let us move the dead Americans to a spot in rear of my CP where the chaplain would pick them up with a jeep and trailer for burial. The jeeps towing the 357mm anti-tank guns arrived around 9 o'clock, and I was impressed by the apparent lack of noise. The crews placed the guns in camouflaged positions in the brush around the farmhouse, covering both L and I Company fronts. I definitely decided that our own supply jeep could come all the way forward the next night. Naranjo and Zelin, the messengers from battalion, arrived and brought with them a wire-laying crew from the wire section of battalion headquarters company. The crew laid a new wire from our CP to battalion on the return trip. Another crew from the artillery laid a line to the observer in the farmhouse, thus giving us 3 separate direct wires to the rear in case any of them should be knocked out by shelling. The battalion messengers brought copies of the Stars and Stripes, army daily newspaper that most of the men read avidly. I already knew that there were never more than 12 copies for the whole company, and that the papers were usually 2 days old or more when we received them. The Spearhead, a 2-page mimeographed information sheet published each day by Division Special Services, with news compiled from radio broadcasts, usually reached us the evening of the day the news was broadcast. Around 11 o'clock, I rose to make a trip to the forward platoons. I was not anxious to go. I could visualize 1,001 things taking place at the CP while I was gone that should have my attention, not the least of which might be a counterattack. But I wanted to have a closer look at the positions, and I felt my visit might make the men feel a bit better. At least it would show them that I was not afraid to visit them. Lieutenant Glasgow also wanted to visit the platoons and check his machine gun positions, so we decided the 2 of us would go together. It was not raining outside, but a chill wind blew across the hills and down the valleys, wrapping the cold dampness of the night closely around us. The moon was nowhere to be seen, but a dull glow of light through the clouds kept the darkness from being completely black. We made our way down the forward slope of the shell-pocked rise that secreted the company command post, and crossed a small stream that trickled down the bottom of the draw I knew divided the 2D and 3D platoons, and was defended farther to the left by the 2 pillboxes occupied by the 2D platoon. I saw to our front the outline of the knoll defended by the 3D platoon, and heard the sound of shovels digging in the rocky earth. A chorus of coughs that I knew had been aggravated by the weather reached us as we came closer. We found the foxhole that the men called the platoon CP. Lieutenant Ante was around somewhere in the platoon area, but Technical Sergeant John M. Garcia of Noble La, the platoon sergeant, offered to go with us to find him. We found him talking with a group of men in his centre squad. His clothes were covered with dry mud, and his hands were equally grimy. Even in the darkness, I could see that a heavy growth of beard covered his face below his glasses. If I had not known him, I could not have picked him out as the platoon leader, so similar he was in appearance to the GIs digging in the floors of the foxholes around us. He escorted us around the platoon area, showing me the locations of his 3 squads, his bars, his bazookas. Everywhere the men turned to talk with us. I spoke briefly with the 3 squad leaders, Staff Sergeant Walter N. Stone of Athens, Gay, Sergeant Archie R. Jones of El Reno, Okla, and Sergeant Jack Webster, an Oklahoman whose adventure in running across an enemy minefield in France at such a speed that the mines exploded harmlessly to his rear was a story told to every replacement upon arrival in the company. Any idea that I might have entertained that my visit would bolster the morale of these men was overshadowed by the effect the visit had on my own morale. How they could smile and laugh and joke in their present condition I could not see, but each man had a cheery word for me as I approached. If I had had any doubts that these men would weaken under the hardships of their cramped positions and the adverse weather, those doubts dissipated completely. Their courage and fortitude evoked a mix of admiration and envy in me, and brought a lump to my throat. However, Lieutenant Ante was concerned. "I've got some men with terrible colds," he said. This awful weather. A couple of them have already asked to go back to the aid station, and I know they should go, but we're so damned short of men. I told them to try to stick it out until tomorrow night, and if they don't feel any better, then I'll send them back. I suggested that if he had men he felt were too sick, he should send them to spend the night at my CP. They can get a little sleep and come back down just before dawn, I said. I wasn't entirely sure what degree of sickness I expected him to interpret as too sick. As we reached the right flank of the platoon, I noticed a man huddled in his foxhole, trembling violently beneath a blanket that covered his head. Lieutenant Ante grasped him by the shoulder. "I thought I told you to dig this hole out deeper," he said sternly. The blanket came off the soldier's head. "You're putting me way off here by myself, so I'll be killed," he shouted, half sobbing. "You want to see me killed. There's nobody over here but—" "Shut up," Ante said. "You want the whole goddamn German army to hear you? Get to digging that hole. There are 2 men right here with you, and the next hole's 10 feet away. Nobody wants to see you killed." We turned away. I looked back over my shoulder at the soldier. "He's been like that ever since he's been with the platoon," Ante said. "Uses every excuse he can to get to the rear. He won't work to get himself warm like I try to get him to do." "If he doesn't improve tonight, send him back to the CP," I said. "We can keep him there for a night and see how he turns out." We moved on toward the 2D platoon. I decided to rotate the 1st and 3D platoons every 3 days. A variety of underbrush and several tall trees in front of the 1st platoon allowed them to move around slightly in daylight, and 2 pillboxes in the area enabled the men to dry their clothing. The 3D platoon positions were miserable. Private First Class Martin W. Carlson, a Pennsylvanian, stood guard at the entrance to the rearmost 2D platoon pillbox as we approached. Although medics were usually attached to rifle companies from a battalion medical detachment, Carlson was a bona fide member of Company 1. When the company had found itself short a medic once in France, Carlson, who had some medical training before being transferred to the infantry, took over and served as a medic from that time on. "They let anybody stand guard these days," I joked as we reached the pillbox. "Yes, sir," Carlson smiled. "I figured I might as well pull my turn. My red crosses are inside." We crouched to negotiate the low entrance to the pillbox. The entrance was the fighting aperture from which the Germans had defended the pillbox, as all emplacements in the area were designed for defence to our rear. Our men defended the pillboxes by digging a series of foxholes around the perimeter. A flickering light from a German canteen with a crude wick maintained a pallid smoke inside the pillbox and cast hesitant shadows on the walls. The room was smaller than my CP, but had a number of bunks and space for a table. The men's faces were black from the crude lantern. "Got the gasoline out of the TD," someone said. Lieutenant Brock explained that they had moved into the pillbox only a few hours before my arrival and were enjoying its relative comforts. They would bring in a number of men at a time to get some sleep, and during the daytime leave only a skeleton force in the foxholes outside. There seemed to be no fear that the Germans would retake and reoccupy the emplacement, as had happened with the previous unit, which had filled in the entrance. One of the squad leaders, Staff Sergeant John A. Kuziel of McKee's Rock, PAR, was in the pillbox at the time of my visit, along with Lieutenant Brock, Technical Sergeant Middlebrook, and Staff Sergeant Carl Oram of Lincoln, Nebraska, the platoon guide. Brock and Middlebrook accompanied us as we left the platoon CP and briefed us on the location of the 3 squads. We moved up the draw to a second pillbox, where members of the squad commanded by Staff Sergeant Sam J. McGonigal of Haskell, Oklahoma, were digging shallow trenches to connect a defensive network of foxholes. Under a raincoat to protect it from the dampness stood a .50 caliber machine gun. "We got that off the TD out there in the draw," Sergeant McGonigal said. "Got a lot of sea rations and Boku cigarettes." Thus far, I had not noticed any bodies of either German or American soldiers in the 2 platoon areas we had visited. Brock mentioned there was 1 GI to the right of his CP, and 2 Germans 50 yards in front of McGonigal's squad. I informed him of battalion's decision regarding the removal of bodies, but we decided to wait until the next night when I could have a stretcher sent up with our supplies. We visited the 3D squad, commanded by Sergeant Robert J. Rouse of Binghamton, New York, and prepared to move on to the 1st Platoon, heading back in the direction of the company CP to approach the platoon from the rear. I saw the rearmost pillbox, which the platoon had thus far not occupied. As we approached, I saw the bodies of 4 Americans and 6 Germans draped in the positions into which they had fallen in death. They seemed to grope with lifeless arms for the protection of the pillbox. My eyes were drawn irresistibly toward them, but I forced myself to turn away. We pushed through a hedgerow that ran parallel with the company front and came upon a group of men improving their foxholes. They directed us to a pillbox a few yards to their right front, where we could find Lieutenant Goffigan. The area here was even darker than the surroundings due to the tall trees shading the faint glow of light that penetrated the clouds from the hidden moon. Long emerged from the pillbox upon the call of the guard, squeezing his way out of the entrance half blocked by a large slab of concrete that had evidently been blown there by some feeble attempt to demolish the pillbox. He was a tall, straight Virginian, young, with square-cut features, and spoke with a typical clipped Virginia accent. He showed us around the area, pointing out a 3rd pillbox 50 yards to his front that he was not occupying, but where he kept an outpost during the day and a listening post nearby at night. He planned to dig open the entrance to the rear pillbox either later that night or the next. We spoke with Sergeant Harry J. Sickmiller of Wauseon, Ohio, and Staff Sergeant Edward Clark of Talking Rock, Gya, 2 of the squad leaders, and prepared to move on to the 3D squad. Long stopped us to draw my attention to a man digging a foxhole to my left. "What do you think of that, Captain?" he asked. I looked in the direction he indicated. 5 feet from the hole where the soldier dug indifferently lay a dead German, his chest and stomach bare, and his stomach a mass of clotted blood and intestines. "The hogs have been eating on him," Long said. We moved on to the 3D squad, commanded by Staff Sergeant Raymond Meade of Centerville, Iowa, and also spoke with the machine gun section leader, Staff Sergeant Alan Diaz of Laredo, Texas, whose guns were dug into the squad area. I told Long my plan for exchanging positions with the 1st and 3D platoons at 3-day intervals. Then Scotty and I turned to return to the company CP. A soldier concealed in the hedge that followed the trail separating us from L Company challenged us as we passed. I hastily gave the password. An enemy mortar barrage began to fall several hundred yards to the rear of the company CP, and we quickened our steps lest the mortarmen shorten their range. It was 1 o'clock in the morning when we re-entered the pillbox. I tried to settle down to write several letters, but couldn't concentrate. My thoughts kept returning to the courage and determination of the men in the foxholes. I began to sign my name to the bottom left corner of the envelopes that comprised the day's mail from the men in the company. Except for the official censorship stamp that would be imprinted on the envelope later by the mail orderly, Corporal Robert G. Brodhead of Chicago, the letters would not be censored further. My thoughts continually returned to the forward foxholes as I wrote. Cold, hungry, miserable infantrymen, scared as hell inside but too brave to admit it. Outside, the night was quiet. I stepped out of the pillbox and found that the rain had set in again. An occasional barrage of friendly artillery whistled overhead, and I silently thanked heaven that the missiles were not intended for us. Conversations with the platoons over the telephone revealed that quiet prevailed in their conversations with the platoons over the telephone revealed that quiet prevailed in their front. It was 3 o'clock when I suggested to Savage, stifling a yawn, that we awaken Blackburn and Lieutenant Flame to take our places while we got some sleep. I awoke shortly after 11 and ate a K ration, reheating a canteen cup of coffee from the water can that the supply sergeant had brought up the night before. Sparky informed me that Scotty had been zeroing his 60mm mortars all morning, firing at selected targets and recording the firing data so that the platoon leaders could call for specific concentrations in the event of trouble. An enemy machine gun had fired from a gate 300 yards down the draw, at men from the 2D platoon who were investigating the abandoned tank destroyer. Lieutenant Brock had called for mortar fire, and the weapon had not fired again. The first enemy shelling of the day came in shortly after I awoke. It was intended for the 3D platoon, but fell without damage well to the rear. It was the vanguard of 3 other barrages that came in during the afternoon, but caused no damage other than to increase our nervousness. Night settled down all too quickly, and the darkness soon enveloped even the slanting rain that continued to plague the forward platoons. Conversations with the platoon leaders revealed that colds were worsening. Ante had 2 men whom he felt obliged to send back to the aid station, and Brock had another, an assistant squad leader. Ante said he was sending the man I had seen shaking so violently in his foxhole the night before to spend the night at my CP. He was afraid that after all he might be really ill. He was complaining now of a pain in his side. I was waiting for the arrival of the supply jeep when an excited whistling came over the sound-powered telephone. I recalled the excitement of the previous night and looked at my watch. It was almost the same time, a few minutes after 7 o'clock. "We hear the tank again, Captain." It was Lieutenant Goffigan. "It's a hell of a lot closer now than it was last night. Seems to have slipped up on us, and it's headed this way." It might have been the calmness of Long's voice, or the fact that I was no longer a virgin to the nocturnal visits of the enemy's tracked vehicles, or it might have been the comforting knowledge of the big anti-tank guns emplaced around the farmhouse, but the overwhelming fear that had engulfed me with the first event was absent now. In its place was a spine-tingling excitement. It was a matter of minutes before I had an artillery officer on the battalion telephone and requested the same concentration we had used the night before, with the range shortened by 100 yards. He said he would fire 3 rounds and we could adjust from them. The time between the call and the overhead whistle of the artillery shells seemed much shorter than it had the previous night. "I couldn't see those, Captain," Middlebrook said, "but they sounded good. Can't tell too much by sound, of course." He paused briefly. "Wait a minute. The son of a bitch is taking off to the rear. Tell him to increase the range 300 and let him have it." I hastily repeated the instructions to the artillery. He said, "Roger," and he'd fire for effect. I tapped my fingers on the table until I heard the low boom of the big guns to the rear and knew that the artilleryman's signal would be forthcoming soon. "On the way!" "Roger," I said. Then into the other phone. "On the way, Middlebrook." I waited for Middlebrook's sensing. Then, "We've hit something, Captain. There's a fire blazed up bigger'n hell. It's lighting everything up around here as bright as day. Sounds like ammunition popping off." The artillery officer said he would fire 9 more for good measure. Willie had been on guard again outside the CP. He came in gesticulating wildly with the news that we'd hit a tank and "the son of a bitch is burning like all hell." I turned the phone over to Savage and went with Willie to the entrance of the pillbox. Before I stepped out into the open, I could see the light from a huge blaze illuminating the countryside. The flames flickered on the walls of the farmhouse. We ran up the sloping walkway to the trail, and I looked to the front. The blaze was spectacular but disappointing. The fire had burned down from its original height, and the burning outlines of a haystack were plainly visible. Ears too eagerly pitched for the noise of the destruction of an enemy vehicle must have perceived the sound of exploding ammunition. I went back inside and explained the situation to the artillery officer. He seemed equally disappointed and asked if that was all. "We're a bit short of ammunition here," he said. "I think I'll connect you with the big guns, and you can zero in a concentration with them. They don't fire too much, and we'd do well to save our ammunition until you definitely locate something." The Fire Direction Centre of the 15th Field Artillery Battalion, the supporting artillery with 155 mm guns, answered. I gave the officer the approximate coordinates from my map of a proposed close-in concentration. From his overlay of my positions, he judged that I was firing too close to my lines with the big guns, so he increased the range by 200 yards, saying that we could pull it in closer if the first rounds seemed safe. Middlebrook was the eyes of the 3-way team. I warned all platoons to have everyone keep close in his foxhole, and we soon had a concentration plotted which scattered fragments as far back as my command post. L Company called to see if we didn't think we were hitting a bit close, but Middlebrook and the platoon leaders were overjoyed at the promised protection that the close-in concentration afforded. We pulled in 200 yards closer than the original safety allowance. The big shells seemed to land almost on top of our forward foxholes, but the riflemen, hiding deep in their holes from the whirring fragments, were delighted. The artilleryman said it would be Concentration Queen 163. Sergeant Nefash arrived with the supplies shortly after 8 o'clock, and the 3 men who were sick with colds climbed aboard. The man from the 3rd platoon, whom I had seen shaking so violently in his foxhole, had arrived, but I sent him to bed in one of the rear bunks of the CP pillbox. Perhaps he would be over his spell by morning. The supply jeep, driven by Private First Class Earl Hayes of Perrysville, Ohio, pulled almost noiselessly to the rear. A check of the supply items revealed that there were cold hamburgers with bread and coffee to supplement the K-ration diet. The stretcher for removing the bodies was also there. When the battalion messengers arrived, I noticed that the man from the 3rd platoon continued to shake violently, as if he were freezing despite the 6 blankets we had placed over him. He continued to complain of pain in his side, and despite his reputation as a gold brick, I was worried about him. I sent him to the rear with the messengers to report to the aid station and called the battalion medical officer to pay particular attention to his case. The aid station returned the call shortly to tell me they had evacuated him. I was relieved that I had not delayed longer in sending him to the rear. He had acute appendicitis. The 1st platoon carrying detail took with them the stretcher for removing the bodies. I apologized to Long for having to order the men to carry out the gruesome task, but the morale effect of the bodies in the area was bad, and it was common decency that the men be given proper burial as soon as possible, even though they were not from our own outfit. I did not ask what the platoons did with the German dead. We had planned to bury them in one of the pillboxes, sending their identification papers to the rear for proper report to the International Red Cross, but now we were occupying all the pillboxes in the area. I presumed that they took them forward of our lines and left them there, but I did not question. They brought the papers to my CP. I knew that the 2nd platoon had no difficulty with the German dead. The only 2 corpses were 50 yards from their forward foxholes. The morning after my visit with them, the bodies were gone. Perhaps even as I had visited them, the Germans had sneaked up and taken the bodies away. The 2 men from the 1st platoon who were detailed to carry the dead Americans to the base of a power pole a few yards in rear of my CP made 2 trips before they stopped in the CP around midnight. Sweat rolled from their faces, and the scent of death from their bodies quickly filled the room and was nauseating. The job was too much for 2 men, they said. The bodies were heavy after more than a week of death. I disliked ordering 2 more men to share the distasteful task, but I called the 2nd platoon to provide help. I apologized to the men for having to detail them to the job and explained the situation to them. Looks like if we got to stay up here and get killed, somebody else could haul our bodies away, one of them said. The 4 men stopped back by the CP around 2 o'clock when their task was completed. I tried to ignore the smell of death that they brought with them and invited them to have a smoke. They remained for some time, talking and heating coffee over a cardboard fire. They said the rain had stopped again, but that it seemed to be getting colder. The night settled down to noises that were becoming routine. A barrage of our own artillery shells whistled overhead on a harassing mission. A telephone call from battalion told me that K Company thought an enemy patrol of 6 men had slipped through their lines. I warned the platoons to be on the alert, and Savage told the guards outside to pay particular attention to the rear. A guard challenged a wire crew from L Company checking the line to their platoon CP in the farmhouse. K Company called to say that what they had thought to be an enemy patrol was actually a few head of cattle. I called the platoons again. Savage notified the guards. The switchboard operator called and said, "Just checking the line, sir." The night wore on. I awoke the next morning at 10 o'clock and stepped outside the pillbox. The sun was shining down with a light so intense that I blinked involuntarily and rubbed my eyes. The effect, after the days of rain and overcast skies, was exhilarating. All seemed right with the world, and I wondered why we must be huddling in pillboxes and foxholes shooting at other men a few 100 yards away. It seemed ridiculous and insane. A glance to the rear of the pillbox brought me sternly back to reality. The bodies of the GIs the men had removed the night before were stacked beside the power pole. The blanket used in covering the stretcher was wrapped around the top body, and only the top of the dead soldier's head protruded, his long blonde hair blowing gently in the wind and shining in the sunlight. How peaceful they looked, lying there on the cold, bleak hill, stacked like cordwood, oblivious to the sparkling sunshine. They would be just as oblivious to the cold and the rain to come, and bursting mortar and artillery shells and threats of enemy counterattacks. I turned away and went back inside the pillbox. I hurriedly fashioned a K-ration breakfast and joined the group of headquarters men sitting around the entrance, talking and smoking. I brought out my shaving equipment, and for the first time in a week I shaved, and for the first time in 4 days I washed my face and hands. I felt rejuvenated. I put up my shaving equipment and returned to sit near the pillbox entrance to soak up the invigorating warmth of the sunshine. For the first time since we had moved into the defensive position, I was completely warm. The beautiful day was marred by 2 enemy artillery barrages, but it ended all too soon nevertheless. Night settled down once again, night with its weary early hours of activity when I would sit nervously by the phones, expecting to hear an artillery or mortar barrage fall at any minute with tragic effects to the men of the company as they moved about their early evening tasks. Then came the long, dreary hours of quiet in which I waited expectantly for I knew not what. The supply jeep came and was gone. L Company called to complain that my supply jeep was breaking the wires to their platoons. The runners from battalion came and were gone. 2 more men from the 3D platoon, sick with colds, arrived to spend the night in the pillbox in an effort to avoid turning into the aid station. They would return to their platoon at dawn. Long and Ante decided to make their shift in platoon positions beginning at midnight. The exchange went slowly. I listened with ears primed with fear for the sounds that would mean an enemy attack while the men were engaged in the shift. 4 o'clock came. Lieutenant Ante called to say that the exchange of positions was completed. 4 o'clock and sleep. I awoke at 10 for the start of the 4th day in the pillbox. It was a day of K-rations, glorious sunshine, adjusting artillery fire, testing telephone lines after enemy shelling, signing one's name to the envelopes of countless letters, requesting supplies from battalion, and 100 little things that were becoming more and more routine. But always there was the deep, fearful dread of the enemy mortar shell that dropped unheralded from the sky, of the artillery round that screeched a fiendish warning as it approached, and the deep dread, too, of the darkness that would come tonight, just as it had come last night, and just as it would come the next night and the next. Any night the darkness might release a horde of fanatical German soldiers eager to kill and drive us from our holes and pillboxes, or perhaps a flame-throwing half-track spouting its flaming, oily death into the deepest recesses of the pillboxes. The night came and pressed on. 3 men were evacuated with high temperatures from colds. The male orderly brought the first mail we had received since we left France. The night wore on. It became increasingly difficult to stay awake. I gave up at 3 o'clock and succumbed to the momentary soothing peace of sleep. Colonel Tuttle called to talk with me at 8 o'clock. Sparky told him I was sleeping, but I heard him and got up, mentally marking off the beginning of the 5th day in the pillboxes. The colonel apologized for waking me. A number of our planes would be over to strafe and bomb German positions the next day. He wanted coordinates from my map of likely targets for the fighters. Sparky told me that an alert bar man in the 2D platoon had killed 2 Germans just after dawn. He had picked up a squad of men moving along a dirt road almost a half-mile away. The Germans evidently thought it wasn't light enough to be seen. With another man observing the strike of his tracer bullets with field glasses, the soldier had traversed the length of the squad with his automatic rifle. 2 Germans fell. The others made away in a ditch beside the road. A German machine gunner from high on the ridge to our left flank opened up with long-range fire on the area around the farmhouse before I could get back to sleep. The bullets whined inches above the top of our pillbox. I tried to adjust artillery on his position, but he was evidently firing from a pillbox, and my fire proved ineffective. His bursts of fire caused no casualties, but kept us more confined than usual. My mortarmen were pinned to their cellar in the rear shed the remainder of the day. "The sun-so bitches won't even let a man take a crap," Willie said. I remembered that the day was more than just October 8th. It was Sunday. We would soon have been in the positions for a week. I wondered again how much longer we would be there, if some morning orders would come to assault the high ridge to our front, or if welcome news of relief by another unit would come. But other than the realization that it was Sunday, there was little difference for us in the day. Church services were held in Grof-Kampkenberg, but there was no practicable way our men could attend. Battalion called shortly before dark. A coded message told me that a patrol from Company L would leave around 7 o'clock in an effort to silence an enemy pillbox that had been giving them trouble from their left front. I was to get battalion clearance for all artillery or mortar fires I might call for during the time they were out. The Germans were nervous when night came. The noise of a burp gun would echo across the hills from far to the right. An answering burst would telegraph its nervous message from our front. Minutes later, the same weapon would fire again. Another burst would come from our left front and another from the left flank, emphasizing the horseshoe-like position which we held. The nervousness was like a malignant disease that ate itself up and down the line and back again. The tracked vehicle that had so alarmed me several nights before returned again shortly after 7 o'clock. I discussed it with the platoon leaders, and we decided that it must be a supply vehicle that brought up food every night. We would ignore it unless it came closer. A rapid burst of small arms fire came from the direction of the L Company patrol, then 3 faint explosions, then quiet. 30 minutes later, another burst of fire sounded from farther to the left, then quiet. The patrol must have met resistance on one route and then tried another, I thought. The second burst of fire must have meant that they were discovered again. I wondered if there were casualties. The supply jeep came and was gone again, taking with it 2 more men for the sick list. Temperatures from colds were climbing. Many men who should be in bed were sticking it out in their holes for just one more day, and then just one more day. The racking coughs must have telegraphed the location of our positions to the enemy.